Welcome to a brand new 12-week series of Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Rich Planet TV is a fully independent show which does not accept as truth most of the unevidenced reporting in mainstream media and attempts to get past their perception management strategies in order to get closer to the truth about what is going on this planet. If you're not interested in the truth, then please switch channels now. One thing I will point out before we get the show underway is that Rich Planet has produced over 200 hours of films and TV shows, all available to watch online from richplanet.net. Some of this material has not been allowed on television, even though it is evidence-based. Find in-depth films about the Cumbria shootings and the Madeleine McCann story and many other issues from the links on the screen. This week's guest is the author of the blog website The Truth Seeker's Guide. For over 5 years, he has discussed subjects like mind control, ufology, false flag events, social engineering, psychological warfare, health, energy, and consciousness. Recently, he has specialized in esoteric and occult symbolism in the output of the mainstream media. In 2013, he published his first book, Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda, which examines the connections between famous science fiction writers, directors and producers and the machinations of the global elite. He has given a number of talks at alternative knowledge venues in the UK. Welcome, Carl James.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
All right then, Carl. Now, we're going to talk today about Stanley Kubrick and your research into his work. Now, I covered the issue of the moon landings with Andrew Johnson in two previous TV shows. If you want to look those up, that's show number 145 and 146. And Andrew presented a great deal of evidence which casts massive doubt over whether the moon landings were as reported. Let's just put it that way. Now, in those interviews, we mentioned Stanley Kubrick and his front projection system, which he developed in the 1960s, which some say was used as the sets for the moon landings. But before we get into that, just give us some background on Stanley Kubrick and who was Stanley Kubrick?
He was a very eccentric character. He was a bit sort of anal in the way he made his films. I think he only ever made sort of 13 sort of big films. I think he did a couple of documentaries and sort of low budget films beforehand, but because he was so meticulous about the way he made his films, it took him years between films. So everything in his films was put where it was for a specific reason. He drove the cast and crew bonkers with sort of repetitive shots and things like that. So he really was, everything that's in his films that I would argue is there for a reason. It indicates something. And he was also a very well-connected man as well. He had a lot of what I would call establishment connections, people high up and...
Right. Now, so what you're saying is he was so pedantic that, let's say there's just an ornament or something on a set, it's going to have a reason for being there. Yeah,
I would say so, yeah.
And you've looked at a vast amount of information.
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence of that, yeah.
All right. Because people might say, well, why are you bothering to look at this? What's the point? Why are you looking into his background? If it is a lie, the moon landings, if they were faked, as a lot of people now believe, it's a massive lie. As Bart Zabrell said, it's a satanic lie. And it needs to be exposed. So looking into the background of Kubrick is important. Now you've split your research up into 3 areas. I'll just tell the viewers what they are, and then we'll go down into each one. There's the connections that Kubrick had with certain key people who were linked to NASA and other organisations. The clues in the films themselves, as we've just
predominantly
mentioned.
The Shining is the main film, but there are clues in other films as well.
And also other films that have been produced which put forward the case that Kubrick was involved, but do it in a really bad way to make people think that no, he wasn't really involved. Kind of a limited hangout. So what connections did he have?
First of all, I wanted to sort of quote from this article that it's called Dr. Strangelove, a strange and terrible glimpse into the deep state. And I don't know the name of the author, but it really sums up Kubrick, sort of where he is. Basically, the author says, Kubrick seems to have been aligned, probably very loosely, with what I like to refer to as the Anglo-American establishment, when typical conspiracy theorists rail against the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the international bankers, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds and so forth. This is essentially who they're referring to. But this is not the only power elite within the international community or even the United States itself. One of the most compelling aspects of Dr. Strangelove is its nuanced view of the American power structure and the confirmation it gives of a divide within the structure of the organisations. So certainly if you look at Dr. Strangelove, which is a real condemnation of the military-industrial complex, you can sort of see that he's allied sort of to a group that opposes that sort of...
So Dr. Strangelove was a 1960s film which preceded
early 60s,
his 2001
That's
film.
right, yeah.
And just give us a brief outline of what it was about.
Basically, it's just showing the ineptitude of the people in power, and it instigates that they instigate a nuclear war, basically, and the end of the world, and the total incompetence of everybody involved, the Russians, the Americans, and no one has a clue what anybody's doing, and who holds the keys, basically, to setting off the bombs and that, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Did Kubrick then actually make certain connections with high-up people in the making of that film then?
He did, yes, yeah. I mean, one of his consultants was this chap called Alistair Francis Buchanan, who's the director of International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is effectively connected to the Round Table Group, Kissinger, the Rothschilds, that sort of thing. And he actually pointed Kubrick to the film's the source of the inspiration for the film, which was Peter George's novel Red Alert. Peter George was also known as Peter Bryant, and he was a British intelligence officer as well. So,
right.
Also a couple of other things. Sterling Hayden, who played Brigadier General Jack Ripper in the film, had an extensive career in the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA as well. So, yeah, there's a few connections there, even at that point. So,
right. And then we come on to 2001, The Space Odyssey. So I understand that Kubrick consulted people at NASA for this. So what would the reason for that be then?
It's basically been put across that he wanted it to be as accurate as possible. He wanted it to sort of reflect what was going on with NASA at that time. He wanted it to be sort of an extension of the technology that NASA was allegedly creating at that point. So, so he brought on a lot of people involved with NASA. Clark himself was heavily involved with NASA. He had high connections in NASA, but he had these two principal scientific advisors on the film, Frederick Ira Ordway III and Harry Langer. Ordway was a former member of the American Rocket Society, space scientist, and author of technical books about spaceflight. He worked with ballistic rockets until 1960, followed by 3 years at Marshall Space Flight Center. So he was, you know, and Langer was an illustrator and designer for the aerospace industry, head of NASA's Future Projects section, worked with Wernher von Braun on nuclear propulsion ideas like that, space platforms. So they're well connected chaps.
All right, and Bertrand Russell?
Yeah. I mean, actually, there's a number of people that.
Who's not so much a technical person, more of a...
there was this group of people that sort of hangers-on consultants for him, and he'd approach them on all kinds of subjects. He was talking about the possibility of AI intelligence because of the Hal character in the film and that. So, and Bertrand Russell, having been involved with the Fabian Society and the Round Table organisation, connections to Tavistock methodology and all that. A couple of other people, Margaret Mead, B.F. Skinner as well, he consulted them. Very well connected in that sort of area. Tavistock methodology, that sort of thing. Margaret Mead herself, her husband, Gregory Bateson, was Director of Research at the Veterans Hospital, Palo Alto, involved with MK Ultra mind control research as well. So, you know, she was also involved with this group called the World Federation of Mental Health, which is probably quite well known. And the president of that was Dr. John Rawlings Rees of the Tavistock Clinic and British Psychological Warfare Bureau as well. So,
right. And the film set was visited by senior Apollo administrator George Mueller.
Mueller, yeah.
George Mueller, and an astronaut.
Yeah, Deke Slayton, yeah.
And the documentation of the visit was classified secret at the time.
It was, yeah, which is very peculiar. I don't know exactly when it was classified and when it was declassified, and it looks as though it was available from about 1975 onwards. It was certainly available from about 1996. Yeah, so there's this photograph of Deke Slayton, George Mueller, Fred Ordway, Clark and Kubrick walking across the lot. And apparently George Mueller said that he called the place NASA East, based on all the technical equipment that was there and the paperwork, documentation, all that. But that photograph and some of the paperwork associated with it was classified with this memo dated June 4th, 1965, for the attention of Eric Goldman, special consultant for Lyndon Johnson. And basically in the document they're talking about Kubrick being this profoundly influential film director. And they were considering him for involvement in this film festival that was going to go on at the White House. So
Right.
it was a very politically orientated thing. I don't know whether he actually did attend. Production was quite, you know, by 64 the production of 2001 A Space Odyssey was already up and running.
Right.
I think it was released in 68, so it's a good sort of 4 or 5 years that it was
So
going on.
over a number of years, over sort of a 4-year period then,
Yeah.
Kubrick's got all these connections within NASA, and he's in, the set is called, what did he say?
NASA East. they
NASA
called it,
East.
yeah.
And then in 69 we had the alleged moon landings.
Yes.
So you've created quite a good case there for that he was clearly very well connected.
Yeah, I mean,
with NASA and all.
yeah, I mean, can I just say as well that in terms of the companies that were actually involved with it, I'll just quickly read out what Frederick Ordway actually said about it. Yeah, Frederick Ordway basically said, we relied heavily on advice from NASA. A considerable number of private companies, found myself visiting General Electric, Missile and Space Vehicle Department, the Bell Telephone Laboratories, Whirlpool Corporation, Honeywell, which I think now is associated with JPL and NASA, IBM as well, and those cooperative arrangements were began in New York and then they were carried over to the production in England
Right.
as well. So it's a lot of companies heavily involved with the production of it.
All right, and Carl, well, we're going to go to the first break, and after
Okay.
the break we're going to talk about some of the clues in Kubrick's films. Welcome back. I'm talking to Carl James about his book, Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda. Now then, Carl, you mentioned some of Stanley Kubrick's connections, and one of them was to someone from the CIA.
Yeah.
So this is Alfred Hubbard, yeah?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
just tell us about him.
Well, basically, the story goes that he introduced Kubrick to LSD, and Hubbard is known to have been a key player in the CIA's LSD distribution network, and he was a high-level officer in the OSS as well. He was allegedly involved with the Manhattan Project, and he also worked for NASA via a subcontractor called Teledyne, which was a defence subcontractor during the 60s. And what basically that he did was testing psychochemical agents on astronauts and pilots for
Right.
the US Air Force and NASA and that. So it's interesting what some people have said about the NASA astronauts, you know, this idea of possible mind control programming, that sort of thing. And you've got sort of NASA closely connected with somebody who's actually doing that sort of thing, testing
well,
the
the
agents.
Apollo 11 astronauts certainly looked like they were under mind control in their press conference when they came back from, well, when they allegedly came back from the moon. All right, well, let's look at some of the clues in the films, Carl.
Yeah.
And just to reiterate, this guy is not someone who's just putting something accidentally in his... He's in charge of every minute aspect of dressing the set. Including choosing the carpets, choosing people's clothes, everything. Right?
Some directors wouldn't get that level of involvement, but I mean, he drove the crew mad with his level of involvement. He really did. He was just.
And he's someone who's probably thinking on different levels as well.
I would say so.
Right.
Yeah.
Just tell us about.
Well, I mean,
because this has been covered in feature-length films by other. You just want to touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Room 237 is a documentary that talks about the symbolism in The Shining, and it actually features the researcher Jay Widener in it as well. And he does put across, given the limited amount of time he's got to appear in it, he puts across some points, that he's covered in his own films, like Kubrick's Odyssey, which is an interesting one. Talks about the front screen projection as well. I mean, I can come on to some of the more questionable ones in a minute, but I mean, people do forget sometimes that 2001 itself, although it's a story about the possibility of extra, it is essentially a story about a cover-up, because you've got the American scientific military establishment covering up the existence of this monolith on the moon, and the signals coming in from the vicinity of Jupiter, really, and basically the government in it, they feel no obligation to inform the citizens. They talk about how the secrecies, explain it away. claimed that public awareness could lead to panic and all this kind of. So it's essentially a film about a cover-up.
Right.
Forget that, you know.
Right. A man-made object somewhere in the solar system.
Possibly, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if we've gone to The Shining, because what you would possibly claim is that Kubrick was very uncomfortable, if indeed he did film some of the hoaxed moon landings, very uncomfortable that he'd been asked to do that.
That's the contention,
and
yeah.
He can't possibly speak about it because he'd get murdered.
Well, I mean, some people say that eventually did happen to him, but yeah.
So he's trying to tell everyone about this, using a different layer in particular in The Shining.
Yeah.
So just tell us what the clues are then.
It's subtext, really. I mean, there's been a number of researchers have pointed out loads and loads of examples, so I'm not sort of pointing out anything original here. This is what a lot of other researchers have put. There's this scene where Jack Nicholson's character, Jack Torrance, is interviewed by the manager, and people say that's a metaphorical sort of his induction into to whatever NASA was getting Kubrick involved with. The presence of the eagles in the film, there's one on Jack Torrance's t-shirt, there's one in the office in the window. People say like the eagle has landed. Also the typewriter that he types all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy on it, you know. That's an Adler typewriter, which the word for Adler in German word is eagle, basically. In German it's Adler. In the room where the typewriter is, there's these Indian totems that are painted on the wall. I don't know if they're like a tapestry or something like that, but they basically, some people say they look like the Saturn V rockets taking off. There's also this really interesting scene where Torrance's son Danny is sitting playing with his toys on the carpet in the corridor. He's got a jumper on which has got a white rocket on it, which is Apollo 11 USA on it. Some people say that the hexagon pattern on the carpet vaguely resembles the Saturn V launch pad and things like that.
So the bit on the typewriter, was that meant to be a euphemism for Apollo?
Some researchers claim that, yeah. Some people say that. I mean,
and why would that spell out Apollo?
I think it's just because of the similarity that the ALL is like A11, Apollo 11. So Apollo work and all makes Stanley Kubrick a dull boy, and so I think it's Jake Widener that's concerted that.
Right, all work and no play.
No, well, all Apollo work, Apollo 11 work and all play makes
Kubrick A11 dull boy.
Yeah, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. Now, but there's also numbers in the key of the one.
Yeah, yeah. It's room 237, and Jay Widener again has said that. He claims that the average distance between the Earth and the Moon at the time of the film being made in the American Heritage Science Dictionary measured as 237,000 miles, which is room 237. I know now the contemporary measurements are sort of more around the 238, almost like 239.
Now let's just expand on the front projection system, because I think this is something that people can actually look at and check out, because is it Jay Weidner who's made a whole film about this?
Yeah, Kubrick's Odyssey. Yeah.
Front screen projection is a cinematic device that allows scenes to be projected behind the actors so that it appears in the camera as if the actors are moving around on the set provided by the front screen projection. The process came into fruition when the 3M company invented a material called Scotchlite. This was a screen material that was made up of hundreds of thousands of tiny glass beads. These beads were highly reflective. In the front screen projection process, the Scotchlite screen would be placed at the back of the soundstage. The plane of the camera lens and the Scotchlite screen had to be exactly 90 degrees apart. A projector would project the scene onto the Scotchlite screen through a mirror, and the light would go through a beam splitter which would pass the light into the camera. An actor could stand in front of the Scotchlite screen and he would appear to be inside the projection. None of what you were seeing in the 8-man scenes at the beginning of 2001 was actually shot outside. The scenes that surround the 8 men in 2001 are actually slides of a desert being projected onto the Scotchlite screen standing at the rear of the set. As part of the trick, it becomes necessary to place things in between the screen and the set to hide the bottom of the screen. I have photoshopped a line differentiating the set and the background Scotchlite front projection screen. Please note how everything is in focus, from the pebbles on the ground in the set to the desert mountains beyond. Let's examine a few NASA Apollo images now. This is a still from Apollo 17. This is also a great example of the front screen projection process. Again, I have photoshopped a line indicating the back of the set. One can see that there is a slight uprising behind the rover, which is hiding the bottom of the screen. Also notice that even though everything is in focus, from the lunar rover to the mountains in the background, there is a strange change in the landscape of the ground right behind my lines. This is because the photo of the mountains being used on the front projection system has a slightly different ground texture than the set. As we go on, we will see that this fingerprint is also consistent throughout the Apollo images. Here's another Apollo image. Now here is my version where I show the line between the set and the screen. Not all lunar surface shots are using the process. Sometimes the astronauts are just standing on the set with a completely and suspicious black background. The early missions, Apollo 11 and 12, used the front screen projection system only when they had to. But as the missions went on and they had to look better, Kubrick began to perfect the process.
So at the time, it was the state-of-the-art
it's pioneering technique, yeah.
technique to film something inside and make it look outdoors.
Effectively, yeah. Providing you got the photography of the background right, you can, yeah.
So if the moon landings were filmed on Earth, then that's going to be the thing that they probably would have used. Possibly.
I mean, you've got to consider what they would have used as the backdrop. I mean, if they're going to make it look like it's actually the moon, you know, they're going to have something to work with. But of course, even when you look at the images of the moon, there's inconsistencies in the mountain ranges and things like that in the background. So, and also you've got this differential between the foreground, almost like rough foreground, smooth background, like a differentiating line between the two, which some people argue would, if that was the technique that was being used, it would be the differential between what was real in the foreground and the projection. Changing over to the projection in the background.
They can never match the artificial background texture.
Not exactly, no,
to the actual
there would be giveaways,
studio set. And well, I think Jay Weidner actually draws this line between the set and the backdrop in some of the NASA images. So if anyone's going to be a candidate for having filmed these things, it is Kubrick. Now, I don't think mainstream have really covered this issue correctly or fairly, and a good example of that was this discussion program on, I think it was Channel 4.
Channel 4, yeah.
Channel 4.
Yeah.
It was hosted by John Ronson. And featured various UFO-related or moon hoax researchers at the time. Just tell us about that, Carl.
I mean, I don't want to sort of really put any sort of blame on any of these people involved, because I mean, I have tried in a limited fashion to contact them and see if they can confirm whether Kubrick was actually talked about in this program. Well, basically, it went out on 25th February 1997. David Percy, Mary Bennett, Barry Reynolds, Matthew Williams, Andy Thomas and Marcus Allen. So, I mean, you've got a good stock there of people who've done research into the moon hoax. And they talk about this scene in Diamonds Are Forever, where there's this moon buggy and a fake moon set, which probably most people would be familiar with that. And they do talk sort of generically about disclosure in Hollywood films, but they don't mention Kubrick at all.
Well, it's a James Bond movie, and people say, what's that scene doing in there? He walks into this lab, and they're going to the moon, and he says, I've come to inspect your radiation shields.
Yes,
Okay, and the next thing he does, he walks out of the lab onto a moon set with astronauts pouncing around and phony backgrounds to it.
And a studio.
That's right, it's a complete studio.
I remember this
and
scene.
he ends up being chased out of this set.
Leaping
so you have a
onto the
connection
rover and rushing off.
in a James Bond movie of a lunar set and a statement just prior to it that says, I've come to inspect your radiation shields. Now, isn't that interesting?
And these movies were made for a purpose then?
Well, certainly all the movies are made for a purpose. One is to entertain, two is to make a lot of money, or possibly the other way around. One is a product of the other.
But are they also made for a slightly more sinister purpose?
I don't think James Bond is made for a sinister purpose. I think we have possibly, there is a zeitgeist in artists that they're going to pick up the general energy of what's going on, and scriptwriters who are very close to the edge of things are going to incorporate into all work, as anybody does, a painter, writer or whatever, they're caring about things. And as you know, in repressive societies, you can get a lot said in fiction or in entertainment that you can't actually say straight out. And just because America is not labelled a communist society, it does not mean to say either that it's a democracy.
Because Ronson's actually made films about Kubrick.
Yes, he has. Yeah, he made a film called Kubrick's Boxes, Stanley Kubrick's Boxes. He interviewed his widow, Christiane Kubrick, for the Guardian newspaper as well. I mean, he's done a lot of. He's a big fan of Kubrick. Very big fan of Kubrick.
So in these interviews that Ronson is hosting, and frankly is very patronising in my opinion, and some of his attempts to, his quips at some of the guests are, in my opinion, desperate. And he actually says, he turns to, I think it's David Percy, and he says, surely the natural progression of your investigation would be to try and find out the people who took the photographs where the moon landing was faked, the television studio. Have you never been interested in trying to discover that?
Yeah,
he says that.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But then there's no discussion of Kubrick.
No, that's right.
So it's got to have been removed from that programme, which is what mainstream media do. They get a whole load of people who are interested in a particular issue, they film them for 5 hours, and then they put 1 hour out of what they want people to see.
Yeah.
And that's what I suspect happened with that programme.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that it was edited out, you know, but nothing's ever been mentioned about it. I'd like you, because there are so many things about John Ronson as well that I would. So you know, okay. I mean,
I'm not expanding
But so it's a big sort of question hanging over it. I can't understand, but given what I've come to understand about the way the Kubrick sort of Apollo connection is discussed, if it did happen, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. I mean,
All right then, Carl, we're going to go for another break, and we'll continue this discussion in a few minutes. Welcome back. I'm talking to Carl James about his research into the background of Stanley Kubrick, who many people say was used to film the hoaxed moon landings, which were actually possibly filmed on Earth. Now, one of the most important things in your research, Carl, was to try and discover the first reference to Stanley Kubrick being involved in the moon hoaxes.
Or allegedly being involved.
Allegedly. And various stuff was put out in the 1990s to suggest that this sort of idea came around in the 1990s.
Yeah, it's just new at that point, but it wasn't.
Tell us what you've discovered.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I actually fell for to some degree as well. You know, I needed to do a lot more research and find out, but basically, what I call a limited hangout, effectively. It's a bit like sort of 9/11 and ufology, that sort of, you have these limited hangout, and they're